Hello chess friends! In this video I'm going to show you a game in which a strong grandmaster named Beliavsky, rated over 2600, was defeated by Stockfish 15 in the year 2006. Now I know what you're saying, how could such a thing happen 16 years before Stockfish 15 even existed? I'll tell you how. His 15-year-old opponent Magnus Carlsen was playing not like the computer engines from 2006, as evidenced by the fact that I analyzed this game with some older programs which did not choose Magnus Carlsen's move 100% of the time. No, he played the top choice of Stockfish 15 on every single move after Beliavsky strayed from the main line on move 9 until the resignation on move 20, which makes 11 futuristic, computer-like chess moves that Magnus Carlsen used to crush his opponent in exactly the same way that Stockfish 15 would have done 16 years into the future. So without any further delay, let's take a look at the futuristic genius of Magnus Carlsen at work as he plays with the white pieces. A Spanish game with bishop to b5 and a6, standard Ruy Lopez moves. Magnus Carlsen drops the bishop back to a4. For any of you beginners that think that white can win a pawn with bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and then knight takes e5, think again. Queen to e4 hits the knight, hits the pawn. Once the knight moves, queen takes e4 check. You didn't win a pawn, and now you have a worse position. Don't ever do that. Bishop to a4 is what Magnus Carlsen plays here, the main line, and we have knight to f6. Carlsen castles, b5, bishop to b3. Beliavsky plays bishop to b7. Again, for any beginners who think that there's a chance to win a pawn here with knight takes e4, it's not a good idea when your king's still in the middle. Rook e1 could be played here. Let's say, for example, you get out of the way. White could take the pawn out now, but even better is bishop d5, attacking the defender of the pawn. These kinds of attempts to win a pawn early in these Spanish games are not usually worth it. Bishop b7 is a better move. Carlsen plays d3. We got bishop c5. Placing the bishop on an aggressive post. A little more common here is to put it on e7, preventing any annoying pins from white with bishop to g5. Spoiler alert, that move is coming later on. Knight c3 by Carlsen for now though. Beliavsky plays d6. Now that that move is played, this pawn has protection, which means this knight has less responsibility, meaning it can jump over here and get a favorable knight for bishop trade. So now is a good time to move the a-pawn, which is what Carlsen does. Now the bishop has a chance to back up to a2 if knight a5 is played, which is exactly what Beliavsky plays at this point. Knight to a5. A little more common here is to leave the knight on c6 and to play b4. Once the knight retreats, now black can get away with d5, since this pawn is still defended by the knight on c6. But what happened in the game, knight to a5 takes protection off of that pawn. So now d5 is not a viable option. Carlsen backs up to a2 with the bishop. He could win a pawn with the following variation. A takes b5, and after knight takes b3, c takes b3, a takes b5, rook takes, queen takes, knight takes b5. It's true white has grabbed a pawn, but these pawns are very weak. Black's pieces are looking pretty active. This is nothing to get too excited about as white. This is not worth the pawn. Carlsen knows this, and he keeps his light squared bishop on board with bishop to a2. And with this move, Carlsen begins his 11-move streak of playing exactly like Stockfish 15. No difference. b4 now played by Beliavsky, gaining some space, giving the knight a kick. Carlsen goes to e2. Now he's got the standard idea of knight g3 and hopping into this beautiful f5 square, which is unopposed by the bishop since it moved to this diagonal and is no longer watching over this diagonal. Beliavsky immediately takes measures to remedy that problem by playing bishop to c8, but this is a little premature. You don't actually have to make this move right away. First of all, the knight's not even to g3 yet. You could wait for knight to g3, but you don't even have to make it then. The engine here thinks that h6, preventing bishop g5, is the best strategy. And now if knight to g3 is played, black can just simply castle, allowing knight to f5. At this moment, bishop to c8 can be played. Maybe Beliavsky doesn't like this because there's knight to h4. You know, the knight will just be replaced by a knight if the bishop captures it. But black has a couple decent options here. One line the computer recommends is b3, sacrificing a pawn in order to force the exchange of the c pawn. The point is, after c takes b3, knight c6, now you can't keep the knight off of d4 since you moved your c pawn. There's not going to be any c3 to prevent that. And this is a good way to challenge this knight. For example, queen f3, the idea here is to maybe play this, threaten some checkmate. Well, you got knight d4 here. Hitting the queen, queen moves somewhere, now you can start taking on f5. And you don't even have to take this knight out right away. You can choose the right moment to eliminate it with this light squared bishop, if need be. Black is fine here. White's extra pawn's a bit weak. So this would be preferable to what happened in the game. The other option would be to just play something like king to h7, adding some protection to h6, so that after queen to f3, you can play knight g8, adding further protection to h6. The reason is that you want to play g6, and you got to have adequate protection of that pawn before you start trying to kick this knight away, or else it's just going to take that pawn. So you got king h7, you got knight g8, lots of defense to this pawn, so g6 can be played, and you also have the idea of playing queen to f6 in response to queen g3. You know, that defends g7 from the checkmate threat. So two better options for black than what was played in the game, this premature bishop to c8. Now here, Carlsen says, okay, you're playing against knight f5. I won't go for that plan anymore. I'm going to go for a plan of central expansion now. c3, d4, because you took your bishop away from its view of the center. I can get a strong central attack now that you've underdeveloped your bishop. And so c3 is what Carlsen plays. Just getting ready for d4, which will come with tempo on the bishop. Beliavsky takes out the pawn. He's already getting into some trouble here. The engine says that better would have been bishop to e6. And after d4, you still got your b pawn. So you can get a counterattack with b3, driving the bishop back to b1. Then you move your bishop. White is still much better here, probably even winning. But according to the computer, this is black's best chance. But after b takes c3, now black doesn't have a b pawn anymore. And after b takes c3, Beliavsky prophylactically moves his bishop back to b6 because he knows d4 is coming. Carlsen waits a minute and plays knight to g3. First choice of Stockfish 15, although d4 right away was possible. This pawn didn't even really need protection by the knight yet, because if the knight takes on e4, the engine says white gets a strong initiative by making this move, which kind of looks like black just lost a piece, but there is bishop b7 defended by the knight. After bishop takes, knight takes, queen c2, the knight's hit, this pawn's hit, the king's uncastled. White has a winning position here, according to Stockfish. But knight g3 it liked even better. Possibility of jumping into f5 at some moment. Bishop to e6 from Beliavsky. Not the most accurate. The engine says it's more important to play h6 here and keep the bishop off g5. And then after d4, castle, knight to h4. You don't have a good way to keep a knight out of f5. But you can play knight c6 and should still be winning for white, but that was the best chance to prolong the misery, I guess. But after bishop e6, let's take a look and see what's wrong with that move. We got d4, and here black doesn't really have anything better than what was played in the game. Bishop takes a2. Now if you don't take, if you play this h6, to keep the bishop off g5, we're going to see how devastating that bishop is very soon once it gets to g5. But if you try to prevent it here, there's just bishop takes e6, pawn takes, and then the capture on e5. And after this, maybe queen e2. These pawns are extremely weak. You got weak squares around the king side. Something like rook d1 is going to come with an attack on black's queen. Black is totally busted in this line. So bishop takes a2 was the best move at this point from Beliavsky. And after rook takes a2, getting the rook to a2 is actually very helpful for white. Because at this point, if black tries h6, there's pawn takes, and the rook gets to come to d2. Domination of the open d file. This queen doesn't have a lot of options. e5's under attack. The king's uncastled. If you try queen e7, looks reasonable until you realize that knight f5 is pretty devastating because the queen's hit, g7's hit. Can't go to e6 because of that with the fork. very bad. So, castle was maybe the best try, but now Magnus Carlsen gets in this bishop to g5, which is more devastating than it might appear at first glance. The threat is something like knight to h5. We're just going to increase pressure. You can't drive the bishop away. h6, bishop h4, and g5 is not a favorable line for black. This is a good pattern to remember. If you can get 2 pawns for your piece, knight takes g5, h takes g5, bishop takes g5, you've only really lost 1 pawn worth of material. The pin is still alive, and it's not going away. The attack is going to continue on this pinned knight on f6. You can't ever move the queen, or you're just going to lose the knight. You can try to add defense with king g7. That's okay. Queen h3. Knight h5's coming. You try to stop it with rook h8. We'll take, rook d2, hitting the queen. e7's the only square where the queen can maintain defense of the knight, but this fails to knight f5 with the fork. So that's an example of a successful piece sacrifice on g5. So what's played in the game is e takes d4. Oh, let me mention briefly, in case you thought g6 was an idea to keep the knight off h5, this just fails to pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes f6. So you can't really stop knight h5 from coming, and after e takes d4, Carlsen doesn't even worry about recapturing the pawn. Like Stockfish 15, he realizes that knight to h5 creates a threat which is much bigger than the threat of winning a pawn. Beliavsky grabs another pawn with d takes c3. It's hopeless now. If, for example, at this moment, instead you tried h6, there would be knight takes f6 check, pawn takes, bishop takes h6. If you were to move the rook, knight h4 is absolutely devastating. The queen's coming in. Black is going to have to start sacrificing a lot of material to avoid mate. So d takes c3 is played. Black's grabbed a couple pawns, but after knight to h4, there's big problems. The main threat here, let's say black plays something like rook e8. White could play bishop takes f6, and after the pawn takes, queen g4 check. If you go this way, you're getting checkmated, so you have to go to f8, but then knight to f5, covering that square, so again, checkmate is threatened. Rook to e6 gives the king a square, but then queen g7 check, king e8, something like this. Queen g8 check, king d7. You get the pawn on f7 with check, and you're going to either have to put the rook in the way and lose it, or you're going to have to move the king and lose it with check. It's all crushing. So what's tried is king to h8, getting the king off of this file, anticipating the line I just showed you where the queen comes to g4 with the checkmate threat. But now on move 20, after knight to f5, Beliavsky has to resign, because Carlsen is going to take out that g7 pawn, removing a defender of the knight, which will be lost. There's no good way to defend against this threat. If you try to defend the pawn with the rook, we'll take like this, pawn takes like this, bishop takes here, rook's pinned, queen's hit, it's all over. Maybe you want to try knight c6, so that after the pawn is taken on g7, you can play bishop d4, protected by the knight, adding some defense. But then the knight will just go back to f5, hitting the bishop with 2 pieces, and if it goes to e5, then just f4. There's no safe square for the bishop. Black is losing at least a piece, probably 2. And so that concludes Magnus Carlsen's futuristic, engine-like performance from 2006 when he was only 15 years old. I hope you enjoyed that. Please subscribe to this channel for more analysis like this coming soon of the great Magnus Carlsen and other important figures in chess. Thanks for watching.